Your mother may not be as sick as she claims." Those 8 words changed everything I thought I knew about my life. When the call came, it was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in early October. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table in Columbus, Ohio, staring at a stack of overdue bills and trying to figure out which one could wait another month. The coffee in my mug had gone cold nearly an hour earlier, but I hadn't noticed. For the past 2 years, every decision I made had revolved around one person, my mother, Margaret Whitmore. According to her, she was fighting a terminal illness. According to her, every month was uncertain. According to her, every treatment, every specialist, every unexpected expense was the difference between hope and despair. And because she was my mother, I believed her. I believed every trembling phone call, every tearful update, every story about another appointment, another test, another setback. I emptied my savings account. I cashed out part of my retirement fund. I postponed repairs on my home and canceled vacations I had spent years planning. I even borrowed money once, something I swore I would never do, because she called me late one night crying and telling me she needed help immediately. Looking back now, I can still hear her voice. Weak, fragile, desperate, or at least that was how it sounded. The caller refused to give a name. The voice was calm, almost cautious. "I know this is difficult to hear," the woman said, "but I think you deserve to know the truth." Before I could ask another question, she told me to check my email and then hung up. I sat there frozen. My heart was beating harder than it should have been. Something about the call felt wrong, but something else felt familiar. It was the feeling that had been growing quietly in the back of my mind for months. The feeling that certain things didn't add up, that some details never quite made sense, that despite all the money disappearing from my accounts, despite all the sacrifices, I had never actually seen proof of what was happening. I opened my laptop. My hands trembled slightly as I logged in. There was a new message waiting for me. No subject line, no signature, just one photograph attached beneath a short sentence. "Ask yourself if this looks like someone fighting for her life." I clicked the image. For a moment, I thought I was looking at a stranger. The woman in the picture stood beneath bright tropical sunlight with a drink in her hand and a wide smile on her face. She wore a colorful summer dress and oversized sunglasses. Behind her stretched a beautiful resort pool lined with palm trees. People laughed in the background. Music appeared to be playing. The scene looked carefree, relaxed, joyful. Then I recognized her. My mother, Margaret, the same woman who had called me 3 days earlier claiming she was too weak to leave bed. The same woman who had told me she was exhausted from treatment. The same woman whose medical expenses had drained nearly every dollar I had worked for over the last 2 years. I stared at the screen for what felt like forever. My chest tightened. My stomach dropped. Yet strangely, I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't even feel angry. Not at first. I felt something colder. Something quieter. A realization. Because deep down, the moment I saw that photograph, I knew my life was about to change forever. And for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't thinking about how to save my mother. I was wondering if my mother had been lying to me all along. I did not sleep that night. The photograph remained open on my laptop long after the sun went down. Every time I looked away, I found myself looking back. Not because I needed more proof, but because my mind refused to accept what my eyes had already seen. Around midnight, I walked through my house turning off lights that I had forgotten were on. The living room lamp, the hallway light, the small reading lamp beside the couch. Ordinary things, simple things, yet everything felt different. For 2 years, my life had revolved around emergencies. Every unexpected phone call made my heart race. Every text message from my mother filled me with dread. I had trained myself to expect bad news. Another treatment, another setback, another expense. Standing alone in my kitchen, I realized I could not remember the last time we had spoken about anything other than her illness. Before all of this began, my mother had been difficult but familiar. Margaret always had a way of making every conversation about herself. If I mentioned a stressful day at work, somehow her problems became larger. If I shared good news, she found a reason to redirect attention back to her. I had noticed those habits years ago, but they seemed small compared to what she was supposedly facing now. When she first told me she was sick, every old frustration disappeared. I remember that afternoon clearly. She sat across from me at her dining room table with tears in her eyes. The curtains were half closed. A cup of tea sat untouched beside her. Her voice shook as she explained that doctors had found something serious, something life-threatening. I remember reaching for her hand. I remember promising I would help however I could. At the time, the promise felt natural. She was my mother. What else was I supposed to do? Within weeks, my routine changed completely. I drove her to appointments. I picked up groceries. I paid bills she claimed she could not manage anymore. Then came requests for money. At first, the amounts seemed reasonable. A few $100s here, a medical payment there. But the requests kept growing. Whenever I hesitated, there was always a new explanation. Insurance delays, specialist fees, experimental treatments. The stories became more urgent each month. Looking back, I realized something unsettling. Every financial crisis seemed to arrive just as the previous one had been resolved. There was never relief, never progress, only another reason she needed help. By 3 in the morning, I found myself opening old bank statements stored in a filing cabinet. I spread them across the kitchen table one by one. The numbers told a story I had ignored for far too long. Thousands of dollars, then tens of thousands. Transfer after transfer, check after check. Money I had spent years earning disappeared line by line across those pages. My retirement account had shrunk dramatically. My emergency fund was nearly gone. The college savings account I had started for my daughter years earlier had been reduced to a fraction of what it once held. I sat there watching dawn creep through the windows. The sky slowly turned from black to gray. For the first time, I stopped asking whether the photograph was real. Instead, I asked a different question. If my mother had lied about this, what else had she lied about? The next morning, I called my mother as if nothing had changed. My voice sounded normal. At least I hoped it did. Years of practice had taught me how to hide concern whenever she was upset, and now I used that same skill to hide suspicion. She answered on the third ring with a weak greeting that I had heard hundreds of times before. There was a pause, followed by a long sigh. Then came the familiar update. She said she had barely slept. She said she felt exhausted. She said the doctors were concerned about her condition. As she spoke, I looked again at the photograph sitting on my laptop screen. The woman smiling beside that resort pool did not sound exhausted. The woman holding a tropical drink did not look like someone struggling through a medical crisis. Yet I said nothing. I listened. I asked careful questions. I waited. What surprised me most was how easily the conversation followed its usual pattern. Within 10 minutes, she mentioned a new expense. There was a specialist she needed to see. Insurance apparently would not cover the consultation. The appointment could not wait. I closed my eyes and listened to the numbers she quoted. They sounded strangely rehearsed. For years, I had responded immediately. I would tell her not to worry. I would promise to find a way. This time, I simply said I needed to review my finances first. The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it felt significant. Then her tone changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Disappointment replaced vulnerability. Pressure replaced sadness. She reminded me of everything she was supposedly enduring. She reminded me that family should help one another. She reminded me that time was precious. By the end of the call, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel before. Distance. After hanging up, I opened a folder containing years of emails and messages from her. I began reading them one by one. Patterns appeared everywhere. Emergencies always arrived near the end of the month. Financial requests often followed periods when I seemed busy or distracted. Whenever I asked for details, she responded with emotion rather than information. I could not believe I had never noticed it before. Around lunchtime, I called my cousin Rachel Donovan. Rachel and I had always been close, although we had not spoken much recently. After a few minutes of catching up, I casually asked whether she had seen my mother lately. There was a hesitation, a small one. Then Rachel mentioned running into her several weeks earlier, at a shopping center nearly 30 miles from my mother's home. According to Rachel, Margaret seemed energetic and cheerful. She carried several expensive shopping bags and spent nearly an hour walking between stores. Rachel laughed as she described it. She assumed I already knew. I did not tell her about the photograph. I did not tell her about the anonymous call. Instead, I thanked her and ended the conversation. That afternoon, another piece of the puzzle quietly slid into place. One photograph could be dismissed. One strange encounter could be explained. But two separate stories pointing in the same direction felt different. For the first time, I stopped looking for reasons to defend my mother. I started looking for the truth. Over the next few days, I became someone I barely recognized. For years, I had accepted information exactly as it was given to me. Now I questioned everything. Every receipt, every story, every detail. I took a personal day from work and sat at my dining room table surrounded by folders, bank statements, and old emails. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the street. Inside, my entire understanding of the last 2 years slowly began to unravel. The first thing I noticed was how little actual medical information I possessed. I had spent tens of thousands of dollars helping my mother, yet I could not find a single official diagnosis. There were invoices. There were appointment reminders. There were messages describing treatments and procedures. But there was very little that connected directly to a real medical condition. That realization unsettled me more than anything else. I opened one email from nearly 18 months earlier. My mother had attached a document and asked for help paying a specialist. At the time, I had transferred the money within an hour. Now I looked closely at the paperwork. The letterhead seemed unusual. The formatting looked inconsistent. Several details appeared strangely generic. I searched online for the clinic listed on the document. Nothing appeared. I tried again using a different search. Still nothing. No website. No reviews. No address. No medical directory listing. It was as if the clinic had never existed. A chill moved through me. I printed the document and set it aside. Then I examined another file. And another. By late afternoon, a pattern emerged. Several facilities could not be verified. Some phone numbers were disconnected. One address belonged to a commercial office building with no medical practices inside. I sat back in my chair and stared at the growing stack of questionable records. The room felt unusually quiet. Then my phone vibrated. A new email had arrived from the same anonymous sender. There was no greeting, no explanation, only 3 photographs attached beneath a short message. You deserve the full picture. My pulse quickened as I opened the first image. It showed my mother standing on the deck of what appeared to be a cruise ship. Bright blue water stretched behind her. The timestamp caught my attention immediately. According to her messages, she had supposedly been recovering from a serious treatment that same week. The second photograph showed her seated at an outdoor restaurant surrounded by friends. She looked relaxed, healthy, happy. The third image stopped me completely. My mother stood beside a luxury spa entrance wearing a robe and smiling directly at the camera. The date matched a period when she had called me in tears claiming she was too weak to leave her house. I enlarged the image and studied every detail. Then I noticed something else. A woman stood beside her with an arm around her shoulder. I recognized her instantly. Susan Keller, my mother's closest friend for more than 20 years. If anyone knew the truth, Susan would know it. I closed the laptop and looked out the window as evening settled over the neighborhood. For the first time, the puzzle pieces were beginning to fit together. The photographs, the missing clinics, the suspicious paperwork, the endless requests for money. None of it felt random anymore. Somewhere behind those smiling vacation pictures was the truth I had been searching for, and I had a feeling Susan Keller was holding a piece of it. The following morning, I drove to a small coffee shop on the north side of town where Susan Keller had agreed to meet me. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table near the window. Outside, people moved through their normal routines. Some carried grocery bags. Others walked their dogs. Everything looked ordinary, yet my hands would not stay still. For days, I had been collecting fragments of a story that no longer made sense. I hoped Susan could explain them. When she finally walked through the door, I recognized her immediately. She looked older than I remembered, but there was something else in her expression. Uneasiness. She spotted me, offered a faint smile, and sat down across from me. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and stared at the table. "Claire," she said quietly, "I have been wondering when you would start asking questions." The words landed heavily between us. I felt my chest tighten. Susan was not surprised. She had been expecting this. I asked her directly whether my mother had been telling the truth about her illness. Susan closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, I saw regret. Real regret. The kind that comes from carrying a secret for too long. She explained that several years ago, Margaret had become obsessed with money. Not because she was struggling, not because she was desperate. She simply wanted more. More comfort, more travel, more freedom. According to Susan, my mother often complained that life had not given her everything she deserved. At first, I listened without speaking. Then Susan told me something that made my stomach drop. The illness story had never started as a temporary lie. It had been planned from the beginning. Margaret believed that people were more generous when they were afraid of losing someone they loved. Susan admitted she had heard pieces of the plan long before it happened. She thought Margaret was joking. Then the requests for money began. Then the stories grew larger. Then the lies became permanent. I asked why she had stayed silent. Susan looked away toward the window. Her voice became softer. She said she had convinced herself it was none of her business. Then too much time passed. Then she became afraid. Afraid of destroying friendships. Afraid of conflict. Afraid of being blamed. I understood the explanation, but it did not make the truth easier to hear. Before leaving, Susan reached into her purse and placed a small envelope on the table. She told me she should have given it to me months ago. Inside were copies of travel itineraries, reservation confirmations, and photographs covering nearly 2 years. The dates matched periods when my mother claimed she was receiving treatments or recovering from procedures. My eyes moved from page to page. Resorts, cruises, luxury spas, weekend getaways. The evidence was impossible to ignore. When I finally looked up, Susan was already standing. She apologized one last time and walked away. I remained at the table long after she left. The envelope sat in front of me like a final answer. For weeks, I had searched for proof. Now I had more proof than I wanted. And for the first time, I realized this was never just about money. It was about trust. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar, every tear, they had all been built on a lie. For the next several days, I did not contact my mother. That alone felt unusual. In the past, if more than 24 hours passed without hearing from her, I usually reached out first. This time I stayed silent. I wanted to see what would happen. The answer came sooner than expected. On the third day, she called twice before noon and left a voicemail. Her voice sounded fragile, concerned, almost hurt. She said she had not heard from me and wanted to make sure everything was all right. By evening, another message arrived. This one included a familiar story about feeling weak and needing support. Listening to those recordings felt different now. Once, they would have filled me with guilt. Now I heard something else. Repetition, performance, predictability. Every phrase sounded carefully chosen. Every emotion seemed designed to produce a response. Instead of calling back, I continued reviewing the documents Susan had given me. I created a timeline stretching across 2 years. On one side, I listed every major medical crisis my mother had described. On the other, I listed the trips, reservations, and activities shown in the records. The overlap was impossible to ignore. One week she claimed to be recovering from a serious procedure. She was checking into a luxury resort. Another time she told me she could barely walk across her living room. She spent 3 days on a sightseeing excursion hundreds of miles away. As the timeline expanded, so did the financial picture. I returned to my bank records and began matching transfers with travel dates. The results made my stomach turn. Money I believed was paying for treatments had often been transferred just days before vacations. Thousands of dollars disappeared into accounts I had never questioned because I trusted the person asking for them. Late Friday afternoon, I decided to consult someone outside the family. Ethan Brooks had been my attorney for several years and had helped me handle estate planning after my divorce. I scheduled a meeting and brought copies of everything I had collected. Ethan spent nearly an hour reviewing the documents in silence. Occasionally, he asked a question or made a note. When he finally looked up, his expression was careful. He explained that regardless of what legal options existed, the most important issue was understanding the full scope of what had happened. He advised me to keep gathering records and avoid confronting anyone prematurely. That advice matched my instincts. I was no longer interested in arguments. I wanted facts. When I left his office, I felt calmer than I had in weeks. Not because the situation was improving, but because I finally had direction. That evening, my mother called again. This time I answered. She immediately launched into another story about an upcoming medical appointment. I listened quietly while watching the timeline spread across my dining room table. Every statement she made collided with evidence sitting inches away from me, yet I remained calm. Then she mentioned needing additional financial help. The request arrived so naturally that it almost sounded routine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I told her I could not send any money right now. Silence filled the line. Not sadness, not fear, just silence. When she finally spoke again, her voice sounded different than I had ever heard before. And in that moment, I realized the mask was beginning to slip. After that call, I knew the confrontation could not happen by accident. It had to happen on my terms. For 2 years, every conversation had been controlled by my mother's version of reality. Every question became a distraction. Every concern became an opportunity for another emotional appeal. I was not going to allow that anymore. The following week, I invited several relatives to a small family dinner at my house. Nothing unusual. At least that was how I presented it. My cousin Rachel agreed to come. A few other family members accepted as well. Even my mother seemed pleased by the invitation. She told me it would be wonderful to spend time together. Listening to her say those words felt surreal. By then, I had spent days reviewing evidence. I had organized bank transfers, travel records, photographs, and timelines. Everything was neatly arranged inside a large folder stored in my home office. Yet whenever I spoke to her, she continued acting as though nothing had changed. The night of the dinner arrived with cold November air and steady rain tapping against the windows. I prepared food, set the table, and greeted guests as they arrived. Outwardly, everything appeared normal. Inside, I felt remarkably calm. Not angry, not nervous, simply certain. My mother arrived 20 minutes late. She entered carrying a small gift bag and immediately began telling everyone how difficult her recent weeks had been. Several relatives offered sympathy. Others listened quietly. I watched from across the room. For the first time, I noticed how familiar the performance was. The pauses, the sighs, the carefully chosen details. It all sounded rehearsed. Throughout dinner, she remained the center of attention. Stories flowed easily. Concerns were expressed. Questions were answered. Every sentence reinforced the same narrative she had been building for years. I allowed it to continue. There was no reason to interrupt. The truth was patient. Eventually, dessert was served. Conversations became quieter. Coffee cups appeared. Rain continued falling outside. Then my mother turned toward me and smiled. She asked whether I had considered helping with the latest expense she mentioned during our phone call. The room became still. Several relatives looked in my direction. Under different circumstances, I might have felt embarrassed. Instead, I simply stood and walked toward my office. When I returned, I carried the folder. My mother watched me carefully. The smile faded from her face. I placed the folder on the dining table and opened it. No dramatic speech, no accusations, no raised voices, just documents. One by one, I laid them out across the table. Bank records, travel confirmations, photographs, copies of questionable medical paperwork. No one spoke. Rachel stared at the images. Another relative picked up a reservation receipt and examined the dates. My mother's expression changed slowly as realization spread across the room. I explained only what could be proven, nothing more. Every statement matched a document sitting in front of us. Every date connected to another piece of evidence. The room remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Then someone quietly asked a question that nobody else had dared to ask before. If all of this was true, where had the money actually gone? No one answered the question immediately. The silence around the table felt heavier than any argument could have. My mother looked from face to face as though searching for an ally, someone willing to rescue her from the truth sitting in plain view. But nobody spoke. Nobody rushed to defend her. The documents were doing all the talking. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered the years, the sacrifices, the fear, the countless nights I had stayed awake believing I might lose the only parent I had left. That sympathy disappeared as quickly as it came. Finally, my mother cleared her throat. She claimed there had been misunderstandings. She said some of the trips had been gifts from friends. She insisted that stress sometimes caused confusion and memory problems. The explanations sounded weak even to her. Every attempt to explain one document created new questions about 3 others. Rachel picked up another photograph and quietly pointed to a date. It matched a week when my mother had called multiple relatives asking for prayers before a supposed medical procedure. Another family member examined a resort invoice. The amount listed on it exceeded the exact sum my mother had requested from me just days earlier. Piece by piece, the story she had spent years constructing collapsed under its own weight. Then I reached into the folder and removed the final group of documents. Copies of financial transfers, bank records, reservation confirmations, organized side by side. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Money moved from my accounts. Shortly afterward, travel expenses appeared. Luxury purchases appeared. Entertainment expenses appeared. Nobody needed legal training to understand what they were looking at. My mother's face had gone pale. She no longer looked shocked. She looked cornered. For the first time that evening, she stopped trying to explain and started trying to justify. She spoke about sacrifices she had made when I was young. She talked about raising me alone after difficult years. She described opportunities she never had. According to her, she deserved to enjoy life. She deserved comfort. She deserved happiness. The room remained silent. Because that was never the issue. Nobody objected to her wanting a better life. The betrayal was how she chose to fund it. Through deception, through manipulation, through the trust of people who loved her. Then something unexpected happened. One of my relatives asked a simple question. Were you ever actually sick? The question hung in the air. My mother looked down at the table. Seconds passed, then more. Finally, without lifting her eyes, she quietly answered, "No." The word barely rose above a whisper. Yet it changed everything. Several relatives looked away. Rachel covered her mouth. I felt strangely calm. I had already accepted the truth days earlier. Hearing her admit it simply removed the last remaining doubt. Nobody shouted. Nobody created a scene. The disappointment in the room was far more powerful than anger. My mother attempted one final explanation. She claimed the lie had started small and then grown beyond her control. She claimed she never expected it to continue for so long. But even she seemed unable to believe her own defense. The evidence covered years, not weeks. This was not a mistake. It was a decision repeated over and over again. As the evening came to an end, guests quietly gathered their belongings. Conversations were brief. The atmosphere had changed completely. Before leaving, several relatives stopped to hug me. Not because they knew what to say, but because there was nothing left to say. When the front door finally closed and the house became quiet again, my mother and I were left sitting across from each other. For the first time in 2 years, there were no lies left standing between us. Only the truth. And the truth had already made my next decision clear. After everyone left, neither of us spoke for a long time. The rain had stopped outside, and the house felt strangely still. My mother sat at the far end of the dining table staring at the documents that had finally exposed everything. The folder remained open between us. Photographs, bank records, reservation confirmations, evidence of 2 years that I could never get back. I looked at her and realized something unexpected. The anger I thought I would feel was gone. In its place was clarity. For weeks, I had imagined this moment. I had imagined demanding answers. I had imagined some dramatic confrontation that would somehow make sense of the damage. But sitting there that night, I understood that no explanation could repair what had been broken. Trust does not disappear all at once. It erodes slowly, one lie at a time, one manipulation at a time, one betrayal at a time. My mother eventually spoke. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. She said she was sorry. She said she never intended for things to go this far. She said she thought she could fix everything before anyone found out. I listened quietly. Then I asked a simple question. If I had never discovered the truth, would she have stopped? She did not answer. The silence gave me all the information I needed. I stood, gathered the documents, and placed them back inside the folder. Then I told her something I had not fully admitted to myself until that very moment. I said I could forgive many things in life. Mistakes, bad decisions, poor judgment. But what happened over the last 2 years was not a mistake. It was a choice repeated again and again while watching me sacrifice my future. I told her that every dollar could eventually be earned back. Every financial setback could eventually be repaired. What could not be repaired was the knowledge that someone I loved had deliberately used my trust as a tool. Tears filled her eyes. Yet for the first time, those tears no longer controlled my decisions. I wished her well. I told her I hoped she found whatever she had been searching for all these years. Then I explained that I would no longer provide financial support. I would no longer participate in the cycle of manipulation. And most importantly, I would no longer allow guilt to dictate my life. She asked whether we could rebuild our relationship someday. I answered honestly, I did not know, because rebuilding requires truth, and truth had been absent for a very long time. A few minutes later, she left. I watched her walk down the driveway and disappear into the darkness. That was the last time I saw her in person. In the months that followed, I changed more than I expected. I worked with Ethan to reorganize my finances. I rebuilt my savings little by little. I spent more time with people who had supported me through the hardest moments. I even started seeing a therapist, something I should have done years earlier. Slowly, the constant anxiety that had followed me for so long began to fade. Life became quieter, healthier, more honest. Sometimes people ask whether cutting contact was difficult. The answer is yes. It was one of the hardest decisions I have ever made. But I learned something important. Love does not require endless sacrifice. Family does not require endless suffering. And protecting your peace is not cruelty. Sometimes the person you need to walk away from is the person you never imagined living without. The day I accepted that truth was the day I finally got my life back.